I'm Mike Shepherd, who started Kneehigh a long, long time ago, 35 years ago, and I'm proud to still be here on the journey, and really proud of all the fantastic people I meet and the places throughout the world that I go, and the fact that we keep coming back home to Cornwall as well. That's all I want to say at the moment, so I'm going to hand over to Emma.
I thought there might be a question. I think I'm going to ask you a question, Michael.
Go on then.
I want to know what made you think of, I know you live close to Slapton, so obviously it's a local story, but how did you have the idea of the cat and pulling it all together?
Well, I didn't have the idea. Like most of my books, it's originally it's true. There was a cat in Slapton, and that cat's name, I promise you, was Adolphus Tips. I didn't even make the name up. And all that happened was I came across the story in a local history book because I went into a pub at Slapton. Interestingly enough, in the beginning of the play, in the beginning of the story, it was because I was going to a funeral in Slapton Church and wanted a drink because I was having to say something over the grave of a dear friend who had died, and I needed some Dutch courage, and so I had a beer and I had a bun, and then I looked around this pub wall and there were these black and white photographs of American soldiers in the Second World War carrying furniture in and out of houses in Slapton village. And I just asked the guy behind the bar, what's this? And he said, well, don't you know? I said, no, that's why I'm asking you. And he then sold me from under the counter this local history book, which was all about how the villages, 7 villages had to be evacuated, 3,000 acres of land had to be emptied, a perimeter fence put up around so that the Americans could come and practice their landings on the beach, which was very similar to a beach in Normandy, although they didn't know that at the time, of course. Anyway, all that happened was there was a little girl, equally as horrible as the one you've just seen, I expect, who on the very last day before they were due to leave the farm, they piled everything up on the wagon and the cat was not to be found. And she got very upset, as you saw. And they had to go. And the wire was drawn around. And for 10 months, they did all this live exercising on the beach and with shells falling into the hinterland and houses being blown apart. And then, of course, in June 1944, they went to Americans and the Canadians and the British and the French, whoever was part of the Allies at that time. They went off to France, and there was, meanwhile, this awful accident where 946 American soldiers died on exercise. That happened during the exercise period. But in 1944, June the 6th, they went, and I think the population was allowed to move in 3 or 4 months later, move back to their houses. And they walk up the lane, and there's this little ew, and the cat has survived over a year on its own, being shelled. There we are. You do not have to make stories up. There.
I've got one more question before we see if there's any questions from the audience. I respond to the story for lots of reasons, but one of them is because it feels very much of my mother's generation. She would have been Lily's age. And I visited the graveyards of my great aunts and uncles with my mother. So I feel very much connected to that part of history. In your experience, do you find that children in 2015 understand and connect to the Second World War?
No, not really. I think we are finding it increasingly difficult to engage with the past for young people. That doesn't stop me writing about it a lot because it's my past. It belongs to me. I think there's a problem. The problem is that life today is very immediate, it's very exciting, and it's now, and they're interested in now, and they're interested in the future, and they are interested in fantasy, what you can make of ideas. History is difficult. It's grounded in a world that's gone, that they don't know, that they're unfamiliar with, which can seem, if it's put over in a boring way, and it can be put over that way still, just old-fashioned and not relevant to their lives. And what's really wonderful about this show, and I've been here when there are lots of kids here from the age of 5, 6, 7 up to 17, 18, 19, to grown-up kids like us. And it touches all of them. And that's what, to me, wonderful plays can really do. They can reach all of us. They're not just focused on people of a certain generation. And it lifts history to the present day and makes it live. And that's what you and Mike and this wonderful bunch behind. Have they all gone for a drink or what?
No, they're dotted around.
Are they here, some of them?
We're all raising glasses to you.
Well, this was just amazing this evening. Was it not, folks? I think it's, I had the privilege of working some few hours with them over recent years, over about 2 years, but very, very spasmodically. But I had an insight, the deepest insight I've ever had into how a show, a play is put together. And it was one of the great privileges of my life to see Emma and Mike and these wonderful people weaving the story together and then somehow drawing the threads and making it live on stage. And I did watch the whole thing. I was there with the growing of the songs, of the dances, and watching Mike, if you won't mind me saying this, it's quite interesting. The young ones, when they were learning a dance, they just pick it up. Just like that. It's really boring. And Mike was working really, really hard to keep up, not with them physically, it's fantastic, but just with the steps and all the rest of it. And then what does she do? She goes and changes what he's just learnt and confuses the whole thing. And these beggars over there go and pick it up again, just like that. Yeah. It must be wonderful to have lithe limbs and lithe minds. I'm very envious, and it's been wonderful to be witness to it.
I think you give them a good run for their money, Mike.
There are, I struggle to find what the benefits of getting older are at this moment.
There are none.
I'm
They're
sure,
just
I'm
none.
sure there's a few. Well, there must be a few fringe benefits.
Do you think there are? Shall we talk about this afterwards?
Yes.
It'll be a short conversation.
Yeah, and then we'll just get drunk.
That was the question. Why did you choose Kneehigh, or why did we choose you?
Well, it was a mutual choice, I think. I was a fan already of Kneehigh. I used to come here and watch their shows over several years. So I had been familiar that their work was different from anyone else's work. There is a liveliness, a freshness about it which I really admired. It was, to me, it's theatre as it should be. And so I had it in mind, one day, if, then maybe we could do something together. And I'd spoken to Emma a bit, and I'm not sure, did I suggest something and you turned it down and you chose something else? Yeah. She's like that. She decided, actually I think your mother...
My mother decided.
They decide a lot of things, mothers. Decided this was the story that Emma should do. I was really surprised because I can never see how a story can be put on stage. I'm really bad at visualizing possibilities. Kneehigh are brilliant at visualizing possibilities and the potential of something. And the potential is just so well realized. I was just talking earlier on to a friend of mine about them who read it. She read it. She's an actor, and she read it on CD. And we were talking about what a play does compared to just the words on the page and the heard words. And it somehow focuses and condenses in the most extraordinary way. And I think it's better. I think Shakespeare's right. The play is the thing. And I wish I'd been a playwright, and I wish I'd been an actor. Don't laugh. I would have been George Clooney.
It's never too late.
No question. No, I love the vitality of it, and I love that way of telling stories. I think it's quite remarkable. This wonderful mix of movement and music and words and acting and design. The whole weaving is so extraordinary, and it very often doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, it's quite painful to witness. And like us all, we've been at theatres when it doesn't work, and you really want to walk out. But tonight, what you found was this total concentration from 500 people immersed in the story. And that was because of the intensity and the tightness of the weaving. It was really quite good.
I would argue, and I have argued in the past, that the play isn't the thing, the story is the thing. And I would say that Michael is literally the greatest storyteller in Britain at the moment. And this story... So the amazing synchronicity, because while Michael was saying that he'd seen our work, I sat in a preview of Warhorse with Michael behind me and sort of starstruck by the event and by Michael's work, who's writing with the voice of the child rather than a childish voice, the voice of the child, which is of course what Kneehigh's done for many years, is we play like children. We're childlike, not childish. So there was an amazing synchronicity when we did start talking about doing a project together. And at the same time, my mum, who rarely tells me to do anything these days, said, "You've got to read this book and you've got to do it." And she was very, very right.
I think she's a great mum. In fact, one of the very first things we did a really long time ago, is that we went together to Slapton and stood on the sands where those Americans came in and one didn't come in, and where the people had lived and been moved away, and felt it and breathed it in. And that was very, very important and moving moment for me. And I kind of knew something special was going to happen even then. Didn't quite realize how special it would be. How lovely to have a proper thread going back into your lives. That's lovely. Which is the grandson?
There was something that I think about often when we visited Slapton. It was in the really early days. We were doing what we call R&D, research and development, which is mainly messing around, getting a load of people in the barns and messing around with music and ideas. And we went on this trip to Slapton, and there's a memorial there, a cross. But at the base of it, it's looking out to sea. There are pebbles from the beach, and people have written the names of people that they lost in the war or want to remember and placed pebbles. And it's such a human shrine and a human memorial, and it's so elemental as well. And I often think about that it's all about reaching out through history and through our own families to the people that we knew and that we can touch and remember.
I think what's really important also for young people, joking apart, is that they do understand about the loss of it, the grieving of it, which very often with the films that they see and I suppose the way wars are kind of glossed over on the television a bit, we get no real sense of the awful loss that there is when people die anyway, but in war in particular, because what lingers on afterwards is hate and anger and bitterness. That's what was wonderful about the end of this show, is when we had those words from Martin Luther King. And it's just important that if there is a message from these things for children, that is why it's important. It's not exciting, and not remotely exciting. The minute you make war exciting in stories, you're doing a terrible disservice. But when you can feel the grief of the death of people young, and sometimes futile death, it makes them think, and it makes us think. And that's important because young people now, they see images of violence the whole time on their televisions, and it's so distant. It's just a screen in the corner, and they're real people. They were sons, they were fathers, they were brothers, they were lovers, they were daughters, they were mothers. And the more you hear about that generation, and indeed people today who go off to war and don't come back, and what it does to the families left behind. I mean, most people sitting here listening to this will, thinking back into their own worlds, their own families, they will have known of someone who went away to a war, someone in their family, and didn't come back. But what we don't tend to witness is how the people live on with that grief. And that's important, and we all felt the grief when Harry died, and died. It was done so beautifully and carefully, and I mean that in the best sense of that word, carefully. I think if young people can see that and take it in, I think that's kind of important. I think this is an important play for that reason. How long have I been writing books? I think there's a meaning behind that. I think he's looking at me, he's thinking this person is seriously ancient. I'm now 71. You clap when someone says that? You don't sit there? And I've been writing stories, I think, since I was about 28. I was a teacher and started telling stories in the primary school in which I was teaching, and found that I loved doing it so much that I thought I'd try to write one down one day. So it was really a way. What year are you? Are you year 4? You're going into year 4. I wasn't far out, was I? Well, I used to teach year 6s. And when you get to be year 6, you will be horrible. No, don't look at me like that. You will be. All year 6s, without question, are horrible. Are there any year 6s here? Anyone? Look at it, I'm telling you. When you get to year 6, teachers, there may be a teacher or two here, what you have to do as a teacher is to teach, entertain, educate 35 year 6s. And when you get to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they look at you as if they want to kill you. They really don't want to be there. And it's the hardest thing in the world to get them interested. And I faced the challenge one day and decided to try and tell them a story from the heart as if I meant it. And I found they listened. And I loved doing it so much that I just went on and on and on. And I've been doing it ever since. So I started round about, I can't remember how long ago that is, but you can do the sums yourself.
Did you keep teaching?
I taught for about 8 years in schools. And then with my wife Claire, who's here tonight, we started a project called Farms for City Children, where we take kids from the cities. They come out and live on a farm in Devon for a week of their young lives. And they farm. They go out on the farm, learn about where their food comes from, and about the countryside, and about work, and about getting on together, and all those things. So I just changed from a classroom to the farm. And we've been doing that project now for 40 years. And we've had, 120,000 children now living for a week on 3 farms. So that's what we do. So I went on with the teaching, but in a funny sort of a way. But there is a point to saying that, and that is that what's wonderful about this evening and about the play, which is what we should be talking about, is that we have had 2 hours of the most extraordinary drama played out in front of us. And for a young person to see that, I don't think you ever forget it. And experiences that you don't forget are the truly enriching ones when you're young. And for me, a great book, or a great show like tonight, or indeed a great week on a farm, that's what changes lives. And I mean that. I'm not overstating it. Some people here who are young and they watch tonight will think, oh, I'd like to do that. I'd like to make drama. I'd like to dance. I'd like to sing. I'd like to do those things. And I'm going to the theatre again and again and again. And that's how stuff starts. That's happened with books, and that's what we try and do down on the farm. That was a really good question. Thank you very much.
Well, this story sort of hits all of my buttons from beginning to end. I cry every time I watch it, and that's because of the story and because of my dear friends, old and new, on stage bringing it to life. But my grandparents had a huge effect on my life. I didn't grow up with them, but they were country people, and I was dutifully taken every holiday to visit not only my gran and granddad, but also my great aunts, and I didn't understand them, and they smelt a bit, and they were quite poor and quite difficult. But my mum made sure that I've been to the graveyards and I've laid the snowdrops on the graves of my people. So I found the way into the story through the granddad dying. What's the film line? You had me at hello. He had me at the beginning, at the granddad dying. And that's my way in. My granddad was in the D-Day landings, but he never, ever talked about it. Never to anybody, not to his wife. And I know that because in 2006, when we did Matter of Life and Death at the National, my granddad had already died, but my gran was alive. So I called my family together and I said, tell me everything you know about what happened to my granddad. And he'd never spoken about it. He died in his late 80s and had never spoken. So I felt that this was a very personal window into him. And it's got a cat. It's just full stop, isn't it? I was very passionately in love with my cat when I was Lily's age, and I wrote about her in the programme. And it's got a granny on a motorcycle. And it's about inclusion and people and being cool and being uncool and being British and being so far away from these black GIs. And I found something out which I very much enjoyed much later on when we were doing this. So all of these things were very personal. So this story means a lot to me for lots of reasons. But doing some research on the book, one thing I discovered is when the Americans came over here, and we've got some American friends in tonight, so forgive me, but the GIs weren't very popular in England. And it was felt that they were cocky. We always used to call them oversexed, overpaid and over here. And they were quite cocky. And apparently the American standard of living was much higher than in England at that time. So they thought we were quite backward, that we didn't have fridges and we didn't have many cars, particularly in these rural areas, except the black GIs, who lived a very similar, probably worse life than the British. And apparently it was the black GIs that taught the country British folk treated us with great respect. And apparently there was a genuine comradeship between the black GIs and the very poor, struggling country English people. And I thought that was a wonderful bit of detail that we never knew. Never knew that. So I love it. I love it. I cried today. I always watch the show from the sound desk, so I can stand up and cry and dance. And they all see me, don't you? I'm sort of all over the place, but I can't sit in a seat with you lot because I've got too much wriggling and crying to do.
Can I ask you a question, Mike? You've done, I don't know how many dozens of Kneehigh productions over 30 years?
35 years.
35 years now. As you've done it over the years, you've become more and more, how shall I say, iconic in terms of the theatre company. People expect to see you on stage. And this evening we've seen you, and you have, I have to say, the most marvellous pair of legs. Has he not? But if I can be a little bit serious, I want to know how, after all this time, you can play comedy and tragedy so closely juxtapositioned and do it with such conviction.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I'll show you the back of my head. You might see.
What happened?
Sketches. Well, I was very lucky to be here at all. I was going with my cup of tea, and as I closed the back door to go round to my quarters last night, I slipped horrendously and smashed my head on the concrete steps. Ooh, that's got a reaction. So yeah, I'm only just here on a wing and a prayer. But that's a repeated thing, isn't it, Emma?
I've seen Mike nearly die so many times.
He does this?
Oh, I don't even, yeah. He's had more accidents. Well, he is the cat with 9 lives, but more, really.
I'm getting through him now. I think that I was a teacher too for 8 years. I didn't really like the theatre world. I did have an agent with a big beehive hairdo in Leicester Square. and I didn't really like her very much. And it was fairly obvious that I wasn't good enough. You mentioned my singing and dancing. So I came back to Cornwall as a place that I identify as a place where you can make things happen with a fairly kind of anarchic spirit. And I was teaching at Mevagissey. Years before the Lost Gardens of Helligan became the Lost Gardens of Helligan, they were just Helligan. And I used to take groups of kids into the jungle, and we had the most amazing days. And it was before the national curriculum, and we built dens in the tops of trees. We did cross-country running. We did poetry. We made up stories. We lit fires. I think there's probably within the course of a day, we probably did 10 or 12 things that are illegal now. Absolutely. I used to take children out on fishing boats with strange fishermen that I had a hunch were okay and could be trusted. And then I started Kneehigh, and I started with stunts. We used to do stunts in the harbour at Mevagissey, and then very close to here we put up a tent, and that very first performance, The Adventures of Awful Knorful it was called, Evil Knievel, and I noticed it was in the round and we had 4 exits, and I spent the entire performance trying to escape being arrested. PC Burstow was there all the time trying to nab me as I exited, so I'd run around the tent and make another entrance. And what had I done? Well, I wasn't sure at that time, but I knew I had to keep telling this story to that full house, that full tent of people until the end. And then he put my arm down my back and marched me off because I had no performance license. In some ways, things haven't changed that much, but we have got the performance license. I love to tell stories as well. I suppose you've talked a lot about young people and teaching, and of course we want to inspire and encourage. But it's interesting what happens. I'm not advocating adversity, but sometimes things come out of adversity. So the fact that I did what I did was largely because I was outlawed from most things and had to do it myself. So theatre for me was a rather stuffy place where I couldn't quite understand people, and I didn't like too much acting, but I did like storytelling, and I think that kind of simple storytelling and that simple emotion. Yeah. To go back to your question,
but that is what you don't do. You don't do too much acting.
I don't do too much acting.
But that's what actually Kneehigh is really good at. Is not acting.
Yeah, but there's a seriousness that
there is
that as well, because the reason that we do theatre is that it's not film, and one of the reasons I do theatre is that it's this connection with the audience, and I want you to work. So I don't do too much acting because I want you to imagine. Does that answer it?
No, it does, absolutely. But it's all part, that seems to be part of the Kneehigh ethic, which you're all involved in. So for the sea, we have these ridiculous, and that's wonderful, because that is all you need. And when those people laid the flowers on the sea, it was just the most extraordinarily moving moment. And we've got these ridiculous bars, tin bars here. And I love that. I love the fact, and I also I love the fact that it's here, and that everyone's had a moment, a real extraordinary moment in a field in Cornwall. And I was thinking as I was walking through the darkness there, that I wouldn't mind betting that in this part of Cornwall, maybe in this very field, there were tents with American soldiers.
Well, that whole wall along there,
yes,
that extraordinary wall, that they must have taken down beautiful Cornish hedges, and it's a fairly ugly wall, but that's from the Second World War, and that was built by prisoners of war, Italian prisoners of war. I
certainly felt there was, we all were treading softly on history, doing this here, and doing it in a way with such respect that it was done. Anyway, I just want to thank you and these wonderful, wonderful young people, and some of the older gits in there as well, for the extraordinary work they've done. Thank you so much.